And in the last videos we covered from 2 Peter and from Jude how early Christians kept an Agape feast. And we're going to see in 1 Corinthians how this feast was also tied to the Lord's Supper as well as to the ministry of spiritual gifts. And so before we go to 1 Corinthians, we want to look at Mark chapter 14, verse 12. Mark writes, "On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb was being sacrificed, his disciples said to him, 'Where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?' And he sent two of his disciples and said to them, 'Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. And wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, the teacher says, Where is my guest room, in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he himself will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. Prepare for us there.' The disciples went out and came to the city and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he came with the 12. As they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, 'Truly I say to you that one of you will betray me, one who's eating with me.' So we can see that Jesus and the 12 kept the Passover meal, and it was in this context that he broke the bread, and in this context they shared the cup of wine, which Jesus said, we'll read it here. In verse 22, while they were eating, he took some bread, and after a blessing he broke it, and gave it to them, and said, Take it, this is my body. And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. So in the context of the Passover meal with Jesus and the 12 disciples, he shared from the cup of his blood, and the bread, which is his body. And he shared that with the disciples. And so we see here something that must have been very similar to what was carried out by early Christians who kept a love feast. And it appears from 1 Corinthians that in the context of the love feast, early Christians partook of the body and of the blood of the Lord, and they also ministered via the gifts of the Spirit, which we'll see in 1 Corinthians. Now, this is really important. If you want to understand the faith of the apostles, if you want to understand the faith of the new covenant, this is very important. Because we actually do not have a right to create church the way we want it. As being partakers of the new covenant, we're obligated to recognize what the apostles called the commandments of the Lord. This is not a matter of any church group or affiliation. This is a matter of the Bible. And what can be seen is that early Christians, churches that have been founded by the apostles, practiced something that man, through centuries of tradition, has stripped away. That's why I said faith is not based on a visible tradition made by men. Faith is not based on what everybody does or what everybody says. Faith is based on what God says. That's the basis of faith, what God says. In other words, whatever you do, or I do, or we do as a church, we have to be able to square it with what God has said. Through Jesus and through the words of the apostles. That's not a matter of affiliation, creed, church. No. It comes down to what did God say. So we can see in the Gospels that our Lord Jesus kept the Passover meal with the apostles. And it's worth pointing out that these elements are not a matter of returning to Judaism. If we return to the Old Covenant, we've missed the point, because the Old Covenant was based on the blood of an animal. And the New Covenant is based on the blood of God's Son, who was predestined before the foundation of the world to die and to give his blood as a propitiation for the sins of the world. So, we're not trying to go back to the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. But it's important that we point out what the early Christians as a church believed and practiced, because the idea that Christians came together and feasted together and partook of the Lord's Supper together and ministered in spiritual gifts together indicates that church, as early Christians knew it, through the work of the apostles, was different than what we're calling church today. Did you realize that? If not, that's okay. We're going to get there through the Bible. So, now, before we go to 1 Corinthians, we want to go to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19. And we're going to see an allusion that Paul makes. He doesn't actually explain every detail, but we'll see an allusion here he makes. In Ephesians 5:19, Paul writes, actually in 5:18, "And do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord." Now, why would Paul say speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and in spiritual songs? In other words, in terms of context, how would this happen? How would it happen that Christians would speak to one another in psalms and hymns and in spiritual songs? Does Joe Christian see Bob Christian down at the marketplace? And Joe Christian says, "Hey Bob Christian, I have a song for you." It would seem odd, wouldn't it? Do you think they walked around and knocked on each other's doors saying, "Hey, I have a song for you"? Seems odd. Doesn't seem very likely. In Colossians, Paul wrote, Colossians 3:16, "Let the word of Christ," actually let's go back to 14. "Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity." Who's he talking to? An individual or a church? Well, I mean, individuals don't need to be united with themselves, unless maybe they're schizophrenic. Otherwise, an individual normally is not seeking unity. Paul goes on to write in verse 15, "Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body." Well, we can see, beyond all doubt, Paul is speaking to a church, the church at Colossia. Verse 16, "Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God." Here again, we see the same apostolic injunction given to the believers, the one body at Colossia, that we see given to the believers or the body in Ephesus. So this raises a question. In what context are the believers to sing to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, teaching one another and admonishing one another in the Lord? What is the context? Well, it's not stated in these two epistles, but the people who received the epistles must have known the context, because Paul did not bother to explain the context. So we're going to see from a third epistle what that context must have been. And the third epistle is in 1 Corinthians.